right, welcome to the recap walkthrough for week 6. This one's going to walk you through the recap games for lectures 3 and 4 of Unit 3. So finishing up our unit on law enforcement. As always, highly recommend that you play these games by yourself using the links on e-learning before watching this video. So if you haven't done that, pause this and go do that. Otherwise, let's get started. So the first question is dealing with one of those aspects of patrol within policing. And there's different time intervals that occur between when the crime occurs and when the police arrive on the scene. And so the interval of time between when the citizen calls the police and a patrol car is dispatched, that's the interval of processing time. Discovery time is that interval between when the crime occurs and when it's discovered. Reporting time is how long does it take between when it's discovered to when it's reported. And then travel time is when the time difference between when it's dispatched to when the car arrives on scene. And so as we talked about in lecture, police response time largely doesn't have a huge effect on crimes because much of the response time is outside the control of the police. They really can only control travel time. They don't have any control of discovery or reporting time, and as well as processing time is sort of outside their purview. So when we look at sort of these, how fast do police respond, it really becomes, it's not a great measure because there's so many things that police can't control in regards to that response. But in the case of this question here, looking at those different times, the time differential between when a citizen calls the police and when a car is dispatched, that's processing time. Second question is dealing with sort of findings of a key research study, and this one was the Newark Foot Patrol experiment. Basically, they replicated what happened in Kansas City and did it with foot patrol. And so what they found was that similar to Kansas City, there was no effect on crime, but there was a positive effect on citizen satisfaction. So still no effect on crime with patrol, but you see an increase in citizen satisfaction when the police officers are on foot patrol versus them being on within their cars and sort of isolated from the public. Final question is looking at those different policing strategies and asking you to identify which one uses SARA, scan, analyze, respond, and assess. And so that one is most linked to problem-oriented policing. When we're talking about like community-oriented policing, we're thinking about foot and bike patrols, neighborhood substations, things to sort of make more community contact easier. Zero tolerance policing is the strategy of really cracking down on minor offenses in the hopes that it's going to send a message to criminals that no offenses are tolerated. Look how much we crack down these minor offenses. Imagine what's going to happen if you commit a more serious offense. And then directed patrols are where you target your patrols to areas that have particularly high levels of criminal activity. All right, so that's it for the recap for Lecture 3. Stay tuned and we'll switch to the recap for our Lecture 4. All right, so moving on now to Lecture 4, our last lecture within the law enforcement unit. So questions 1, looking at some of those enforcement strategies when we look at the actual police work, and specifically which sort of drug enforcement tactic would be an example of demand reduction. And so as we're looking through these options, when we're thinking about demand reduction, we're typically thinking about education programs. And the one that's designed for drug demand reduction is DARE. GREAT is also an education program, but that's designed more for gang enforcement ideas. Infiltration and buy and bust are more examples of supply reduction in terms of a drug enforcement tactic. Question 2 is again asking you to think about those Supreme Court cases that we talked about throughout this unit, and it's sort of asking you to recall sort of these sort of police powers and which court case established that they have the legal power to stop and frisk suspects. And so this is the case of Terry versus Ohio. As we've talked about previously in Terry versus Ohio, the big thing here is that the officer must possess reasonable suspicion for the stop and frisk to be legal. But there's a lot of leeway in terms of defining what is reasonable suspicion. Final question, sort of dealing with that issue of discretion and corruption, and it's asking you to think about the typologies that Sherman outlines. And in the case where we see corruption being isolated to a few independent officers, Sherman would sort of categorize that as a type 1, but type 1 as rotten apples because they're working independently. It only becomes a rotten pocket if there's coordination between several officers. Type 2 is that pervasive unorganized corruption where there's sort of a culture within the police department of accepting bribes or doing some corrupt things, but there's no active coordination among officers. And then type 3 is pervasive organized corruption where there's a culture and sort of everybody works together in an effort to engage in unethical and corrupt behavior within law enforcement. So that wraps up our last two lectures for the Unit 3 quiz. And so make sure you use this tool as a way to help you study and prepare for your first attempt.